They beat him in the middle of town, and by nightfall, the town forgot how to keep its doors shut. Before we go on, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. And if you believe justice doesn't always need a gun, stay with me. Now back to the story. The sun sat heavy over Dry Creek, heat shimmering off the wooden boards, dust hanging in the air like something waiting to settle, and in the middle of it stood a man no one claimed to see until it was too late. Elias Red Hawk walked slow, boots worn thin, coat faded by too many seasons, a small leather pouch hanging from his hand like it carried more weight than it should. No horse, no weapon, just a man crossing a town that had already decided what he was. Conversation stopped when he passed. Not loud, not dramatic, just quieter, like people didn't want their words touching him. A woman at the general store turned her back. A man on the porch spat into the dirt. Someone muttered something under their breath, low enough to deny, loud enough to be heard. Elias didn't answer. He kept walking. That was the strange part. He didn't hurry, didn't look around, like he already knew every eye that followed him. Caleb Whitmore stood near the hitching post across the street, thumb hooked in his belt, watching without meaning to get involved. He'd seen men pass through towns like this before, some looking for work, some running from something, some just unlucky enough to stop in the wrong place. This one didn't look like any of them. The pouch. That was what caught Caleb's eye. Old leather, darkened by time, held close, but not hidden, like it wasn't meant to be stolen, but wasn't meant to be opened either. The first voice came from the saloon steps. "You lost, old man." Laughter followed. Not cruel, not yet, just enough to gather attention. Elias stopped. Not fully, just enough to shift the dust around his boots. He didn't answer. Another voice. Closer now. "Ain't no place for your kind passing through here without reason." That word, kind, hung heavier than the heat. A few men stepped off the porch, something together without saying it out loud. Caleb felt it before it happened. That shift. The moment when curiosity turns into something else. He straightened slightly, eyes narrowing, but he didn't move. Not yet. Elias finally lifted his head. His face was lined deep, skin weathered, eyes dark and steady. Not angry, not afraid, just certain. One of the men reached for the pouch. Not fast, not rough, just testing what the old man would do. Elias held on, not pulling back, just holding. For a second, nothing moved. Then the circle tightened. Voices layered over each other. Accusations without proof. Stories that didn't belong to him, placed on his shoulders like they'd always been there. Caleb took a step forward, then stopped, because the old man still hadn't said a word. Not one. And somehow, that made everything louder. The pouch slipped from his hand. Not taken, not fought over, just let go. It hit the dirt with a soft sound. No one opened it. No one needed to. Whatever they thought was inside, it didn't matter anymore. Elias looked at them, one by one, not judging, not pleading, just seeing. Then he spoke, quiet, low, almost lost in the wind. "You lock your doors," he said. A pause, long enough to feel it. "But you left something open." Caleb felt something cold settle under his ribs. Because the way the man said it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a promise. The dust did not settle after he spoke. It lingered, like the town itself was holding its breath, unsure whether to laugh it off or carry it home. And one by one, they chose the easier path. They turned away, brushed their hands on their coats, stepped back onto porches, back into shade, back into the comfort of being right without needing proof. Because that was how Dry Creek worked, not by law, not by truth, but by agreement, quiet and unspoken. And Caleb Whitmore watched it happen the way a man watches a storm roll in from miles away, knowing it will reach him eventually, but not yet knowing how hard it will hit. He glanced down at the pouch lying in the dirt, untouched now, forgotten already, and for a moment he thought about picking it up, not to take it, just to see. But something in the air stopped him, something about the way Elias had said those words, like the meaning had not arrived yet, like it was still on its way, and that unsettled him more than anything that had just happened. Across the street the saloon doors swung once, then twice, though no one had gone in or out. A small thing, easy to ignore, and they did ignore it, because ignoring was easier than asking why. Elias bent slowly, not hurried, not ashamed, and picked the pouch back up, dust clinging to the leather like it had always belonged there. He did not look at anyone this time, did not wait for permission. He simply walked, past the general store, past the well, past the edge of town where the road stretched out into open land, and no one stopped him, not because they could not, but because whatever had just passed between them no longer felt finished, and no one wanted to be the one to find out how it ended. Caleb stayed where he was long after the old man disappeared beyond the ridge, the sun dipping lower, shadows stretching across the ground like long fingers reaching for something unseen. And still that sentence echoed in his head. You left something open. It did not sound like a threat. It sounded like a statement, like a man describing the weather. And that made it worse, because weather could not be argued with. It could only be endured. As evening settled in, lanterns flickered to life one by one, warm lights spilling through windows, doors closing with familiar sounds, bolts sliding into place, routines repeating like they always had. Men sat at tables, women stirred pots, children whispered before sleep. Everything as it should be, and yet not quite, because there was a pause between each movement, a hesitation that had not been there before, like every hand that reached for a door handle remembered something it could not name. Caleb finally turned toward his own place, boots slow against the packed earth, the air cooler now, but no easier to breathe. He pushed his door open, stepped inside, and for a second he just stood there, listening. Nothing moved, nothing spoke, just the quiet hum of a house that had always been his. He reached back and closed the door, the latch clicking into place, solid, certain, the way it always had been, but his hand lingered on the wood longer than usual, as if testing whether it would hold, as if something on the other side might decide otherwise. He shook it off, crossed the room, set his hat down, but even then he found himself glancing back, just once, just to be sure, because out there, somewhere beyond the ridge, a man had walked away carrying nothing but a worn leather pouch and a sentence that refused to stay behind. And for the first time in years, Caleb Whitmore felt like the night was not something you waited out. It was something that was already on its way toward you. The night did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces. First the light fading off the hills, then the color draining from the sky, then the long stretch of silence that settled over Dry Creek like a blanket no one asked for. And inside their homes the people moved slower than usual, not enough to notice at first, but enough to feel like something unseen was pacing just beyond the reach of their lantern light. Caleb Whitmore sat at his table with a tin cup in his hand, untouched, listening to the small sounds that usually meant comfort, the creak of wood, the faint wind slipping through cracks, the distant shuffle of boots outside. Except tonight those sounds felt different, stretched thinner, as if they were being listened to from somewhere else. He leaned back in his chair, eyes on the door again, that same door he had closed with certainty not an hour ago, and for a moment he told himself it was nothing, just a long day, just a strange encounter, just a sentence that had no real weight. But then it came, soft at first, almost polite, the sound of a latch shifting, not his latch, not yet, somewhere else, another house, another door, and then another, a slow rhythm, uneven, like footsteps made of wood and iron. Caleb stood without meaning to, the chair legs scraping the floor louder than they should have, and he stepped closer to his door, not opening it, just standing there, hand hovering near the handle, listening harder. Outside the wind had picked up, carrying dust along the street in thin waves, and beneath it something else moved, not fast, not loud, just present, like a current you could not see but knew was there. Across town a woman pulled her door shut tighter, fingers trembling slightly though she could not say why. A man checked his lock twice, then a third time, and still did not feel settled, because the sound kept coming, not breaking in, not forcing entry, just opening, one door at a time, hinges whispering, latches giving way without resistance, and no one could explain how. Caleb finally pressed his hand against the wood, feeling the grain beneath his palm, solid, real, something he had trusted for years, and still that sentence returned. You left something open. He frowned, not understanding, because everything here was closed, everything was as it should be, and yet the air said otherwise. Then his door moved, not wide, not sudden, just a slight shift, enough for the latch to release with a quiet click that echoed louder than any gunshot ever could. Caleb froze, not from fear, but from the realization that nothing had touched it, no hand, no wind strong enough to force it. Just movement, He did not step back, did not reach for a weapon. He simply watched as the door opened an inch, then two, then slowly, steadily, until the night stood just beyond his threshold, dark and patient, and in that darkness something passed by, not entering, not stopping, just moving along the street like it had somewhere else to be. Caleb stepped forward then, just enough to see beyond the frame. And what he saw was not what he expected. No chaos, no running, no shouting, just doors, all along the road, standing open, each one revealing a slice of quiet inside, and figures, not many, not loud, walking from one house to the next, carrying nothing in their hands, leaving something behind instead, something small, something deliberate, something that belonged. Caleb felt his chest tighten, not from danger, but from recognition he could not yet place, because whatever was happening out there was not taking from the town. It was giving something back, something the town had forgotten it ever held. And as one of those figures passed under the faint glow of a lantern, Caleb saw enough to understand that this was not chance, not coincidence. This was intention, measured and patient, like a debt being counted one piece at a time, and somewhere beyond the edge of that dim light, where the road met the dark hills, a single silhouette stood still, watching it all unfold, holding a worn leather pouch close to his side, as if everything inside it was finally being returned to where it should have been all along. Caleb did not remember stepping outside, only that the night felt closer once he crossed the threshold, like it had been waiting for him to join it, the boards beneath his boots cool, the air carrying that same quiet movement that had slipped through every door in town, and now that he stood in it, he could see more clearly, not the whole picture, not yet, but enough to understand that nothing here was random. Each figure moved with purpose, stopping at one home, then the next, never rushing. Something inside the box, then stepped back out. The motion so simple it almost seemed ordinary. But there was nothing ordinary about the way the air shifted afterward, like a balance had been adjusted, like a scale had tipped back towards something it had long been denied. Caleb exhaled slowly, not realizing he had been holding his breath, and turned his head toward the edge of town, where the darkness thickened near the hills, and there, just as before, stood the man, Elias Red Hawk, unmoving, watching, not commanding, not directing, just present, as if the night itself answered to something older than words. Caleb felt a question rise in his chest, but it had no shape yet, no clear form. Only a quiet understanding that whatever was happening was not meant to harm, not meant to threaten, but meant to reveal, piece by piece, truth by truth, until there was nothing left to hide behind. A door down the street creaked again, slower this time, and Caleb turned to see his own place, his own door, standing wider than before, open enough now to show the faint outline of his table inside, and something on it that had not been there when he left, something small, waiting, patient, like it had all the time in the world, and for the first time since the sun had set, Caleb Whitmore felt something deeper than unease settle into him, something heavier, something that did not come from the night, but from within, because whatever sat on that table was not brought there by strangers, it had been carried there by something he himself had once chosen to ignore. Caleb stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside, not because he was afraid of what he might find, but because something in him already knew, the kind of knowing that does not come from sight but from memory, slow and buried. And as he crossed the threshold, the room felt different, not changed, not disturbed, just heavier, like the air itself had been asked to remember something it had long agreed to forget. The lantern on his table burned low, casting a thin, wavering light across the wood, and there, at the center of it, lay the object, small, unassuming, yet impossible to ignore. Caleb moved closer, each step measured, deliberate, until he stood over it, his shadow stretching across the table like it was trying to shield him from what lay beneath. But shadows do not protect, they only delay, and so he reached out, slow at first, then stopping just short of touching it, his hand hovering in the space between past and present, because now he could see it clearly, a carved wooden token, worn smooth along the edges, marked with patterns he had once recognized but had not thought about in years, not since the day he told himself it did not matter, not since he convinced himself it had been left behind by someone who would not come back for it. But that was not true, Not then, not now. And the truth of it settled into his chest like something that had always been there waiting for its moment. He finally picked it up, the weight light. Almost nothing, and yet it pressed against him like a stone, because the moment his fingers closed around it, the memory followed, not sudden, not sharp, just steady, like footsteps returning along a path he had tried to erase. A dry afternoon, years ago, a man passing through, older, quiet, carrying the same kind of pouch Elias now held, offering nothing but a trade that was never completed, a misunderstanding that Caleb had never corrected, a moment when he could have spoken and chose not to, because silence was easier, because the town had already decided, because one man's voice felt too small against many, and so the token had stayed, left behind, absorbed into his life like it belonged there, until now, until tonight, when it returned not as something lost, but as something remembered. Caleb exhaled slowly, his grip tightening slightly before loosening again, as if holding on too tightly might make the weight unbearable. Outside, the quiet movement continued, doors still open, footsteps still passing, the town still being visited not by force but by presence. And Caleb understood now, not fully, not all at once, but enough. This was not about taking anything away, it was about returning what had been carried too long without acknowledgement. He set the token back down carefully, not in the center this time, but slightly to the side, as if making space for something else, something not yet placed. Then he turned, stepping back toward the open door, the night still waiting just beyond it. And across the street he could see others doing the same, standing in their doorways, holding objects they could no longer pretend did not belong to someone else, their faces not afraid, not angry, just changed, like a layer had been lifted, and what remained was quieter, heavier, more honest than before. Caleb stepped outside again, the cool air settling against his skin, and lifted his gaze toward the edge of town, where Elias still stood, still watching, not moving closer, not needing to. Because whatever had begun here was already unfolding exactly as it was meant to. And Caleb Whitmore realized something then, something that settled deeper than any fear could reach. This night was not about what had been done, it was about what would be done next, and for the first time in a long while, the choice did not belong to the town. It belonged to each man standing alone in his doorway, holding something that had finally found its way back home. The town did not sleep, not in the way it used to, not with doors closed and minds at ease, because now every open doorway felt like a question left unanswered, and every object returned carried a weight that could not be set down again. Caleb stood in the street longer than he realized, watching as the quiet procession continued, not hurried, not endless, but precise, as if every step had been counted long before this night began. And then, slowly, the movement started to thin, fewer figures passing, fewer doors shifting, until what remained was not action, but presence, something lingering just beyond sight, like the echo of something already done. And that was when Caleb noticed it, not in the street, not in the houses, but in the silence itself. It had changed. Before it had been heavy with tension, now it carried something else, something closer to stillness, not peace, not yet, but the beginning of it. He turned again toward the edge of town, toward the dark line where the land rose into shadow, and this time Elias Red Hawk was no longer standing alone. Shapes had gathered behind him, not stepping forward, not advancing, just there, like the horizon itself had taken form, figures standing side by side, their outlines steady against the dim sky, not threatening, not demanding, just witnessing. Caleb felt the shift in his chest again. Deeper now, because this was no longer about what had been returned, it was about what remained, the things that could not be placed on tables, the things that lived in memory and choice. Across the street, Mrs. Harlan stepped out fully onto her porch, the object she had been staring at now held in both hands, her shoulders squared in a way Caleb had never seen before, not out of defiance, but out of acceptance. And one by one, others followed. Doors that had opened now framed people instead of shadows, each of them holding something, each of them facing the same direction, toward the edge of town, toward the man who had said so little and yet changed everything. Caleb took a step forward without thinking, then another, until he stood among them, not apart, not above, Just another man with something in his past that had finally caught up to him. The distance between the town and the ridge was not far, maybe 100 yards, but it felt longer now, stretched by years of silence and choices left unspoken. And still no one crossed it. No one called out, because whatever needed to happen next did not belong to noise. It belonged to decision. Caleb looked down at his empty hands, then back toward his house, the token still resting on his table, waiting, not accusing, just present. And he understood then what had been left open. It was not the doors, not the locks, not the homes they thought they controlled. It was something else entirely, something each of them carried, without naming. And as the night settled deeper, as the last of the movement faded into stillness, Elias finally stepped forward, just one step, no more. And even that small motion seemed to reach across the distance like a question, not spoken, not forced, simply offered. And in that moment, Caleb Whitmore realized that whatever came next would not be decided by the man at the edge of town. It would be decided by the ones standing in the light, by whether they chose to hold on to what had been returned, or to finally carry it back themselves. No one spoke, not when Elias stepped forward, not when the line between the town and the ridge seemed to narrow without anyone moving, because the moment had shifted into something words could not carry. And Caleb felt it settle in his chest like a weight that was not meant to be thrown off, only carried properly. He turned without hesitation this time, boots steady against the dirt, and walked back toward his house. Not quickly, not dramatically, just with purpose, and behind him, he heard it, not footsteps following, but doors, one after another, closing softly, not shut, just decided. Inside his home the lantern still burned low, the carved token exactly where he had left it, waiting in the same quiet way it always had. Except now it was no longer silent. Not to him. He picked it up again, and this time there was no hesitation, no distance between his hand and the truth it held. He looked at it once, then turned back toward the open doorway, and stepped out into the night. Across the street others were doing the same. Mrs. Harland holding her object close, the man with the silver buckle rising from his steps, a young boy standing beside his father with something small wrapped in cloth. Each of them no longer standing still, no longer watching, but moving, slowly at first. Then with a shared rhythm that did not need to be spoken, Caleb walked toward the edge of town, toward Elias, toward the figures waiting behind him. The distance that had once felt stretched now shortening with every step, until he could see them clearly, faces calm, eyes steady, not demanding, not forgiving, just present. And that presence said more than any accusation ever could. Caleb stopped a few feet away, close enough to feel the quiet strength of it, far enough to understand that the next step belonged to him alone. He looked down at the token in his hand, then back up at Elias Red Hawk, who stood as he had before, unchanged, unshaken, holding the same worn pouch at his side. And for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, not divided by race, not by land, but by a choice that had waited years to be made. Caleb did not speak, because there was nothing left to explain. Instead, he stepped forward and extended his hand, placing the token gently on the ground between them, not as an offering, not as a surrender, but as a return, and he stepped back, just one step, enough to show it was no longer his to carry. Around him, others followed, one by one, objects placed in the dust, a quiet line forming not of people, but of things that had found their way home. And still no one raised their voice, no one demanded anything in return, because this was not about balance in the way men usually counted it. This was something older, something that did not measure, only remembered. Elias looked down at the line, then slowly lifted his gaze, meeting Caleb's eyes for the first time, without distance between them. And in that look there was no victory, no judgment, only acknowledgement, as if something long unsettled had finally come to rest. And behind him, the figures began to turn, not all at once, not in unison, just naturally, like a tide shifting direction, and Caleb watched as they moved away, back toward the dark hills, carrying nothing, because there was nothing left to take. And as the last of them faded into the night, the town of Dry Creek stood quieter than it had ever been, not from fear, not from loss, but from the simple, undeniable weight of having chosen, finally, to stop holding on to what was never theirs to keep. The night did not end with their departure. It lingered, settling into the bones of the town like a truth that refused to be shaken loose. And for a long while no one moved. Not Caleb, not Mrs. Harland, not any of the others who stood in the dust with empty hands and heavier hearts. Because what had just happened was not something you walked away from. It was something you carried forward whether you wanted to or not. The line of returned objects remained on the ground between them and the ridge, quiet, untouched, no longer belonging to anyone, and yet belonging to everything that had just been set right. Caleb kept his eyes on the place where Elias had stood, but the man was gone now, not vanished, not hidden, simply gone, like a chapter that had closed without asking permission, and somehow that absence spoke louder than his presence ever had. The wind moved again, softer this time, brushing over the town without resistance, slipping through doors that now stood open by choice, rather than by force, and one by one, people began to turn back toward their homes, not in a rush, not with relief, but with something quieter, something that felt like understanding taking its first breath. Caleb did not follow them right away. He remained where he was, staring at the ground where his token had rested among the others, noticing for the first time that nothing had been taken, nothing gathered, nothing claimed by those who had come. Everything that had been returned now simply remained. And that realization settled deeper than anything else, because it meant the night had never been about reclaiming. It had been about revealing, about placing truth where it could no longer be ignored, about asking a question without speaking it aloud. Caleb finally bent down, not to take anything back, but to look closer, to truly see what lay there. And as he did, he noticed something he had not expected. The objects were not scattered, not random. They were arranged, not in a line, not in a circle, but in a pattern that only made sense when you stepped back far enough to see it, a pattern that mirrored the town itself, each item resting where its weight had once been felt, each space marking a choice, a moment, a silence that had shaped what Dry Creek had become. Caleb straightened slowly, his breath steady now, and turned toward his home, the door still open, the lantern still burning, but the room inside no longer felt the same, not because something had been removed, but because something had been acknowledged. He stepped inside and looked around, noticing details he had not seen before, the way the light touched the walls, the way the floor creaked under his weight, the way the quiet no longer pressed against him but settled beside him, like it belonged. And for the first time in years, Caleb Whitmore did not feel the need to fill that silence with anything, not words, not excuses, not distance. He simply stood there, letting it be what it was, outside. The town continued its slow return to itself, doors closing gently, not out of fear, but out of habit reshaped by understanding. People moving through their spaces with a new kind of care, as if every object, every corner, every memory carried more meaning than it had before, and though no one spoke of what had happened, no one needed to, because the night had already said everything. And as the hours passed and the first hint of dawn began to touch the horizon, a quiet truth settled over Dry Creek, not as a burden, not as a punishment, but as something steadier, something that would remain long after the dust rose again, that what had been opened could not be closed the same way again, and that some doors, once understood, were never meant to be locked at all. Morning came slow over Dry Creek, not with the usual rush of lights spilling over rooftops, but with a quiet that felt earned, as if the land itself had decided to give the town a moment to sit with what it had become overnight. Caleb Whitmore stepped out onto his porch just as the first rays touched the far ridge, the air cooler now, cleaner, carrying none of the weight that had filled it the night before, and yet nothing had been forgotten, not by him, not by anyone. Across the street doors, opened one by one, not cautiously, not with fear, but with a kind of still awareness, like each person stepping out understood that the town they walked into was not quite the same one they had left behind. Mrs. Harland stood in her doorway again, but this time her shoulders were not tense, her hands empty, her gaze steady. She looked toward the center of the street where the objects had been placed, and for a moment no one moved toward them, because they no longer felt like things to be picked up. They felt like something to be acknowledged. Caleb walked down from his porch, boots pressing into the dust that had settled evenly overnight, and as he reached the center of the street, he saw it clearly now, what he had only begun to understand before. The pattern was still there, faint but undeniable, each object marking a place, a memory, a choice that had shaped the town piece by piece. And though the figures who had placed them were gone, their intention remained, not as a mark of judgment, but as a map of truth. Caleb crouched slightly, not to take anything, but to trace the outline with his eyes, and for the first time he saw his own place in it. Not just the token he had returned, but the space it had once filled, the absence it had left behind. And that absence did not feel like loss. It felt like something had been set back where it belonged. Behind him footsteps approached, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady. And when he turned, he saw others gathering, not around the objects, but around each other, a quiet circle forming not out of necessity, but out of shared understanding. No one spoke at first, because words would have been too small for what had settled here. And then, slowly, a man stepped forward, the one with the silver buckle. He did not pick it up, he simply nodded once, as if acknowledging something he could no longer deny, and stepped back. And that was enough, not a speech, not an apology, just a choice to see clearly. And that choice moved through the group like a current, subtle, steady, undeniable. Caleb straightened and looked toward the ridge again, the place where Elias had stood now empty, but not forgotten, and he understood something then, something that had been there from the beginning. Elias had not come to take anything, not to punish, not to claim, but to remind, to open something that had been closed for too long, and then to leave, because the rest did not belong to him. It belonged to the people who remained. Caleb took a slow breath, the kind that fills the chest without weight, and turned back toward the town, his town, not the way it had been, but the way it could be now, shaped not by silence, but by what they chose to do with what they had finally seen. The sun rose higher, light spreading across the street, touching each object, each doorway, each face. And in that light nothing looked smaller, nothing looked diminished, it all looked clearer. And as the town of Dry Creek began to move again, not back to what it was, but forward into something quieter and more honest, Caleb Whitmore understood one final thing. Out here, justice did not need to be loud. It did not need to arrive with force or leave with triumph. Sometimes it only needed a man to walk into a place, say very little, and remind everyone of what they had always known but chose not to see. And sometimes that was enough to change everything.